What this says, and this is kind of a big picture here, is this is an interesting kind of math, this feedback loop, bistability, the other examples of equilibrium points and bifurcations that we have been talking about. This is a math that talks about qualitative changes. And I'm just going to say qualitative change equals bifurcation. And in each of the systems that we looked at, there is a qualitative change that occurs. You remember the deer-moose system? For the mild competition parameters, we had coexistence of the two species. That was a stable equilibrium. But if we just increased that interspecies competition term by a little bit, the system underwent a qualitative change. The coexistence equilibrium point is unstable. You now get two new stable, which is all deer, no moose, all moose, no deer. But if I ask you the question, why does the deer-moose system change from coexistence to no coexistence, there's an answer. And the answer is the bifurcation theory answer, which is that the reason why that change happened was because the intraspecies competition parameter passed a critical point. We saw another example of qualitative change in the spruce budworm model. The spruce budworm sat at a low population. Then when there was a little bit more carrying capacity, a little bit more leaf space, the birth rate went up a little bit. All of a sudden, you had a qualitative change to a new equilibrium point, which was the outbreak equilibrium point. And so the bifurcation theory is the answer to the question, why does the spruce budworm have outbreaks? Answer, because R and K wandered into the bistable critical region. Why does the lac operon switch turn on? Answer, because that R, that degradation parameter, passed a critical point. Now all of a sudden you have a switch. We saw that example of political opinion. It was balanced at the center. Then as that bandwagon effect got larger and larger, all of a sudden the center equilibrium, which had been stable, is now unstable. Two new stable equilibria, all N or all P or all left and all right or all whatever you like. Why did that polarization occur? Because the bandwagon effect strength passed a critical point. So the take-home point here is that this is math that we're doing, but it's interesting in that it has qualitative implications. People think of math as quantitative. Mathematicians calculate numbers to 4 degrees of accuracy. No. This is a math that explains qualitative changes. So with that in mind, I want to go on and show you some more examples of the use of bifurcation theory to explain qualitative changes in biology. In particular, every time in biology we see a concept of a biological switch, we should immediately suspect a bifurcation as producing that switch-like behavior. And I want to talk about two concepts that are used in biology a lot. They're used as words. They have scientific definitions. The concept of differentiation and the concept of maturation. And I'm going to show you work done by others modeling these two phenomena as saddle node bifurcations. So our first example of a saddle node bifurcation is going to be the definition of the concept of differentiation. So what is differentiation? Well, you know, you can have, at the ultimate, you can have stem cells. They can advance a little bit and become pluripotent. Pluripotent means that they can be committed to a lot of different cell types. They can become bone cells or they can become neurons. And that process by which a pre-cell becomes committed to become a neuron, or a pluripotent cell becomes committed to be a neuron or a bone cell, that is differentiation. And in a very interesting paper that was in Science about 5 years ago, Mary Teruel is a professor at Stanford in the very interesting Department of Chemical and Systems Biology. And her paper demonstrates, as she says, that differentiation is a cell decision switch. The cell decides to become committed, and what are the factors that produce that? So she has this nice diagram. So adipocytes are fat cells. And she's dealing with a pre-adipocyte, that is a pluripotent cell that can commit to being an adipocyte or not. And the stimulus that makes the pre-adipocyte commit to the adipocyte lineage, a very interesting drug called rosiglitazone, which is one of our major anti-diabetes drugs. So in the presence of rosiglitazone, the pre-adipocyte becomes committed to the adipocyte lineage. Now look at what she says. These pre-adipocytes differentiate through a bistable switch mechanism with a single threshold for activation that involves positive feedback between two key transcription factors. And then she has her flow chart and a true differential equation. And you'll notice that here is the positive feedback loop. PPAR gamma enhances CEBPA, and CEBPA feeds back positively onto PPAR gamma in the presence of the differentiation stimulus. Her two-variable differential equation has sigmoidal activation right there, which you're totally familiar with. She's using a cube to denote a slightly steeper sigmoidal activation than the square from the Lac-Operon. But this is a positive feedback loop, and it's a positive feedback loop modeled by a differential equation. So she studies that differential equation and produces, guess what? A saddle node bifurcation diagram, which you completely recognize. Here's the unstable, here's the stable and the stable. In this case, the low stable is the pre-commitment adipocyte. The presence of the stimulant rosiglitazone moves you to the right in this diagram and eventually moves you to the point where there is no longer an equilibrium point there, and you have to jump up to the other available equilibrium point, which is committed adipocyte. And so this is a classic bistable switch, almost identical to the Lac-Operon. So the basic idea of her paper is exactly what we are saying. Here is a saddle node bifurcation producing a qualitative change, namely from pre-commitment to commitment. Let's look at another example. Interestingly, also from Stanford and also from the same Department of Chemical and Systems Biology. Jim Farrell is a very senior, highly respected researcher. He was the author of that paper we were just talking about before, about persistent states and the work of Jacob and Monod. Here's an interesting paper where he is talking about maturation. So what is maturation? Well, you have an oocyte, and before the oocyte can be fertilized, it has to undergo a qualitative change from just being an oocyte to being a mature oocyte. And that is a qualitative change. The chemical that brings about that qualitative change of maturation is progesterone. And so in the presence of progesterone, you go from immature oocyte to mature oocyte. So Farrell is actually able, just like in the other paper, Farrell is able to state what the positive feedback loop is. He knows the names of the players. He knows that P42 MAP kinase feeds back positively onto MOS, and that is a positive feedback loop. And then he draws the diagram of the activation-inactivation, and this should look pretty familiar to you. The only difference between this diagram and our lac-operon diagram is that in our lac-operon diagram, the sigmoid was fixed and the straight line moved. Now, this is a slightly different case. The straight line is fixed and the sigmoid moves up and down. But you see that the geometric effect is exactly the same. This sigmoid crosses the blue line once, right there, has a single steady state. As that red curve comes down, as the sigmoid comes down, as you see, a bifurcation occurs, and now we have 1, 2, 3 equilibrium points. They are, of course, a stable, unstable, stable, as he correctly labels. We now have the biological switch that constitutes maturation. Immature is down here, and mature is the high steady state. He draws a very clear saddle node bifurcation and labels it for you. So the increasing progesterone, just as always, the increasing progesterone, you stay at the low state, stay at the low state, stay at the low state until it reaches a point where there is no stable equilibrium down there anymore, and now you have to go up to the other equilibrium branch, which is the mature state. And he says, the process of oocyte maturation is viewed as the traversal of a saddle node bifurcation. He concludes with an interesting point, which I want to stress for a second. So first of all, he says oocyte maturation arises from a saddle node bifurcation. That's great. Look at the last sentence. This type of reductionistic systems biology holds great promise for understanding complicated biochemical processes in simpler terms. I think that's a heck of a statement, and I think it's very, very, very true. I'll be honest, I think we get buried in the biochemical details. I think we get buried in the molecular biological details, and we memorize lots and lots and lots of details, and we lose the big picture. And the big picture, as he correctly says, the big picture is we would like to have a switch that turns on maturation, and here's how to arrange activation and inactivation to pull off that kind of phenomenon. And it is, I believe, and I think he does too, really important that we begin to look at biology in these higher level terms.